The title of the talk is On Being in Life Without Wanting the World, Living in Ellipsis, and there is an abstract for the talk as a loose leaf in the program pack, and a rather nice line at the end. It says, "The talk is less abstract than this abstract." So, wonderful to have you here. Over to you.
What I'm going to do is start by talking about the project that this talk comes from. And because I think context matters a lot, and also it will repeat many of the things Richard said just now, but with a little detail about this particular paper. A lot of what I'm trying to do right now is to describe affective states that have not yet been described. So I'm not working on shame, right, for example, although shame is everywhere. So there's a lot of definitional language in the first 10 pages of this paper, but what I think of it's going to sound like truth statements, but I mean them as propositions, which is how I think theory should always be read anyway. So this goes to the question of experimentality. So I'm going to be making lots of propositions about a way to think about an object, and then going to play out what I learned from those propositions. Okay, so this talk is an experimental development within my forthcoming book, whose title is On the Inconvenience of Other People, Essays in Ambivalence. I know. So if people say I should call it On the Inconvenience of Other People, but not you, or something, but, but I don't think I will. All right. So it has 4 aims. The first aim is to provide a better concept of what we call structure. And this is to say that The Inconvenience of Other People is being conceived of as a response to Sex or the Unbearable that I wrote with Lee Edelman, where a lot of the debates that Lee and I are having throughout the book is whether structure is intractable, e.g. whether it is the real. Okay, he thinks it is because he's a Lacanian of a particular kind, and I don't think it is because I'm not. No, but it made me realize that I thought the problem of thinking about structure is it tends to be a principle of consistency that's calcified. I think that's just a mistaken way to think about it. So the first is to provide a better concept of structure. There are lots of theoretical concepts of structure, but most of the time when people refer to what a structure is, they're talking about sedimented patterns and principles that govern the reproduction of life. In relation to the processes that organize life, I'm defining structure not as intractable, but as that which organizes transformation. So that if you think of the world as always in the activity of reproducing itself, what a structure is it's an organizational principle more than it is an intractable or calcified principle. Things are always changing, and the relation between what changes and what's hoarded in regimes of power, value, and norm is a matter of analysis. Structure is what manages those relations as well as their mediations in the world, which is to say their forms. My second aim is to think about transitional times in relation to the ongoing forces of change and adjustment that organize the contemporary plane of consistency. All times are transitional, but at some crisis times, politics is defined by a collectively held sense that a glitch has appeared in the reproduction of life. A glitch is a hiccup within a transmission, an interrupted transition. State-contrived austerity politics is a politics of the glitch, as are the political practices of the anti-austerity movements, for each recognizes the present as demanding reorganized practices of resource distribution and social relation. In other words, a glitch is not a space where nothing happens, but rather a scene of activity in which we try out tentative forms in order to work out collective aims. For crisis times are not without structure. That is a mistaken notion of structure, confusing a rise in the intensities and awareness of the multiplicity of forces bearing down on the present as a failure of principles of consistency. That sense of lack is an expression of loss in a force or norm of habit in organizing the default sense of what it means to have a life. Collective crisis newly links disparately located and unequal existences and reveals complex, ongoing, and unstable relations among different organizing life-world structures. Under these conditions, politics, or collective struggle, seeks to determine the terms of transition for general social existence. So my claim here is that politically, in a crisis, it is not only a matter of assessing the forms of contingency and imagining an endgame, but offering a structure for transition itself on the way of rebooting life in common. And this has become a big commitment for me in my work, is to try to think what would be the transformational structure within a concept, rather than just thinking, what do I want at the end of it? Besides contributing ways to think about structural transformation by way of transitional form, this project recasts the place of non-sovereignty in social life. Sovereignty is a very big concept in contemporary critical theory, but it crosses over many different isomorphisms between individual autonomy and state autonomy, things like that. But I think it's a kind of mistake to begin with sovereignty. I'd rather begin with non-sovereignty. That is to say, non-sovereign relationality, the way we're dependent on each other, the way all forms themselves are produced as a result of their differentiation from other forms and stuff like that. It produces being in relation as the condition of the subject, and rather than figuring alterity as the condition of the world, considers the pressure of the world as a condition of overcloseness. Alterity might be a style and structure of managing overcloseness, but I begin in the space of non-sovereign pressure. Critical social theory has tended to focus on where the experience of overcloseness produces disasters at a scale that is collectively separate. So this is the next thing. So, mostly we get critical social theory locates itself in the space of disaster, the space of trauma, the space where things fall apart. What interests me for this book is why a threatening object threatens you and threatens your sense of continuity in the world. What's harder to know is why it's so difficult to actually bear the objects you want. And I'm very anxious about this, by the way. The inconvenience of other people is looking at objects we want in love, in the political, and our general sense of having a world, and why they're hard to bear. The chapter 1 is on sex. So this is all about me, right? What are the things I want that I find hard to bear? Chapter 1 is about sex. Chapter 2 is about democracy. And the talk today, chapter 3, is about having a world and whether the world is bearable. Okay. So to engage this problem, this project works against the pervasive and possessive discourse of belonging, insofar as it operates a synonym for being in social worlds, and implied by the theme emotional geographies even. I'm not working on any politics of non-belonging, but I think it's just presumptive in a way to think that just because we're in the room together, we belong to the room. Just because we're in a social field, that we belong to the social field. And so I like to do, I'm always trying to dial back a little bit and ask how forms and modalities emerge from a relation, rather than to presume that that relation is reciprocal and binding and effectively predictable. So this has long motivated the queer project of not presuming scenes and practices of intimacy, for example. Just because a space on a grid is shared intends nothing about the affective and material substance of membership, and even if we're in the room, it doesn't mean we belong to each other in it, or that even though we're in a nation, it doesn't mean that you can't presume the conditions of belonging, that it has to be a matter of analysis, argument, evidence, things like that. Okay, so clarifying that is one thing this paper is about. How can we think about being in proximity to other beings and other forms of life without assuming that we belong to them? Okay. The fourth proposal of this book is that the humanities needs to induce and respect experimental practice, as Richard was predicting, I would say. Each of the essays on sex, democracy, and life itself is a heuristic or thought experiment for shifting styles of ambivalence within attachments to the ongoing world, better to induce forms of life from within the non-sovereign relation, the intimacy that might not feel intimate yet is. And that's what ellipsis stands for in this paper. Okay, so that's the preface. Section 1, No World Poetics, or Elliptical Life. And the epigraph for the paper is from Hannah Arendt, and it is, 3 minutes before certain death, I probably would still laugh. This paper has an indefinite number of sections. One is a conceptual introduction proposing attention to a poetics of dissociation. In contemporary poetry theory associated with Tony Hoagland and Stephen Burt, such a poetics is located in a lyric poetry whose style is distinguished by the accretion of spirited random observations, exemplified in lists, episodes, and an observational tone associated with stand-up comedy and the personal essay as it is with traditional lyric. Associated with poets like Mark Halliday and Rachel Simon, it refuses narrative and fetishizes the seemingly casual, emitting both an elegiac and passive relation to a reality that is failing. Hoagland and Burt claim, therefore, that a dissociative poetic is realism for a world in crisis. Yet, at the same time, they argue, it is entitled and shallow, because art should provide a plane of consistency that heals the world, even if it's also realism. I'm not really sure how they reach that conclusion. Okay, but that's their problem. But among other things, this self-contradictory assessment overpresumes a normative model of integration of persons, poetry, and the world. So let's reboot the concept. Dissociation is at least 5 kinds of thing. 1, an ordinary mode of affective delay in the wake of anything's impact. So the idea that you don't really know the event until the event has its intensity has fallen enough for you to think that something happened. 2, a state like disbelief that registers a gap between being affected and whatever comes next, a gap that is not fundamentally, necessarily, or usually pathological. 3, the standard referent, an unconscious process of managing destabilizing intensities by separating them out so that one does not feel, for example, a conflict among one's need, vulnerability, receptivity, aggression, and knowledge. Again, this state, the state of dissociation, is not necessarily pathological, and trauma is the exception. But we tend to just always call all forms of disintegratedness in some proximity to trauma. I think that's a mistake. 4, a condition of dispersed, multiple, and tangled awareness or self states, often appearing as muted, but just as often appearing in intensified durational scenes of mania or managerial situations like teaching. So think about professionalization itself as a training in dissociation. That you're busy at the same time as you're focusing on something and describing something, your brain is also managing many different kinds of other things. And that hierarchy of attention within your own subjectivity is a form of dissociation. Finally, I will argue dissociation is a predictable effect and experience of taking up a position within the negating pressure of the politicized world. So this is a biopolitical observation, whose pressured intensities induce non-exceptional effects of living and structure. In this talk, dissociation attends to all of these things and more, including an ongoing structural subordination felt in the body as a displacement from the normal and the privileged, and often involving the experience of a weighty multiplicity of knowledges, extreme hypervigilance, and a veering among states from numb to the acute. So those of you who have worked on race theory would understand this minimally to be something like a Du Boisian double consciousness, but then kind of multiply that by the overdetermination of the subject in history, and you've got a dissociative state. So to call dissociation a structure of discontinuity would be to underassess its non-coherence as the name for a continuous state. To disregard its profoundly social and historical character, and above all, to miss its utility in staying bound to life. This talk emphasizes the structure of continuity within this condition of movement as along the lines or non-lines of life in ellipsis. For purposes of exemplification, it leads from and to a discussion of Claudia Rankine's lyric, "Don't Let Me Be Lonely," and the supertext of Christopher Isherwood's A Single Man, involving both his 1963 novel and Tom Ford's 2009 film. Both of these works sort dissociated life with something like a state of disbelief about what it takes to have a life within the sexualized and racialized imperatives of biopower. Both of these works entertain suicide as the name for resolving at a personal level the fissures in the collective sensorium that Adorno calls damaged life. But for all the planning and obsessional return, no one in these texts kills themselves. So this is a paper not about suicide, it turns out, although I worked on, when I was doing this project, this is just a way of saying, like, I hope this happens to you sometime. You know, you read for 2 years and you think you're writing a paper on suicide, and then you sit down and you realize no one actually kills themselves. So it's not actually a paper on suicide, but suicidation. And not the foreclosing act of finitude. So then my object changed because I actually did research, yay. All right, but then I had to deal with it. that was a little upsetting. And although, but good. And although biopower forces individuals in its targeted populations to appear in life in a certain way and as a certain kind of thing, multiple processes shape the dissociative state of the subject who lives at the limit, because social negativity produces many kinds of limit that are organized in many styles of showing up to life.